Kelsey Grammer finally admit the truth about John Mahoney. I used to think the bond between Kelsey Grammer and John Mahoney was simply great acting. Then I learned what was really underneath it, and honestly, it changed the way I see Frasier. Because for Grammer, John Mahoney wasn't just the actor playing Martin Crane. He became something Kelsey had spent most of his life missing: a father. And the strange part is, nobody planned it that way. Kelsey Grammer had already lived through more loss than most people could imagine before he ever became Frasier Crane. His parents divorced when he was just 2 years old. His father, Frank, remained in the Virgin Islands while Kelsey was largely raised by his mother and grandfather. Then, when Kelsey was 13, his father was murdered. That alone could have changed the course of a child's life. But it didn't stop there. Years later, Kelsey's younger sister Karen was murdered at only 18. And then, in 1980, his two half-brothers, Billy and Stephen, died in a suspected shark attack while scuba diving. I honestly can't imagine carrying that much loss before turning 30. And Grammer didn't handle it perfectly. He turned to alcohol and cocaine, struggled with arrests, and eventually entered treatment. From the outside, though, something completely different was happening. His acting career was taking off. He became Frasier Crane on Cheers in 1984, a character that was supposed to be a relatively small addition. Instead, Frasier became one of television's most recognizable characters. Then came something even bigger: Frasier. But here's where the story gets personal. When the producers needed someone to play Frasier's father, Grammer didn't just wait for a casting director to make the decision. He already knew who he wanted: John Mahoney. Mahoney had appeared briefly on Cheers, and Grammer had immediately liked him. There was just something about the man. So Grammer called him. He essentially said, "I want you to play my dad." Mahoney agreed, and somehow the chemistry worked almost immediately. On television, Martin Crane was everything Frasier wasn't. Frasier was sophisticated, intellectual, obsessed with opera and fine things. Martin was practical, gruff, straightforward, a retired police officer who preferred a comfortable chair to a fancy restaurant. They argued constantly, but underneath all of it was love. That's what made it believable. And I think that's also what made it so painful for Grammer, because he wasn't just watching an actor play a father. He was experiencing something he'd never really had. Grammer eventually admitted that he never truly had a father figure growing up in the way many people take for granted. And John Mahoney gave him a glimpse of what that relationship could have felt like. 11 seasons, 11 years. Think about that. For 11 years, Kelsey Grammer got to come to work and spend time with the man who, in many ways, became his TV father, and something emotionally much closer than that. He later described Mahoney as a man of sacrifice, service, loyalty, honesty, and integrity. Those weren't simply qualities he admired in a co-star. They were qualities he associated with the father he'd always wished he'd known. And there was another interesting part of their relationship. Grammer, Mahoney, and David Hyde Pierce developed a genuine closeness behind the scenes. It wasn't just Frasier, Martin, and Niles on television. There was a real affection between the three men. And Grammer has spoken about how unusual that kind of connection can be between men, especially the kind where you don't have to explain everything. You simply know the other person is there. That's what makes what happened in 2018 so heartbreaking. John Mahoney died at 77 after complications related to throat cancer. And Grammer's tribute was remarkably simple. He shared a photograph of the two of them embracing. Then he wrote 4 words: "He was my father." I loved him. I don't think that needs much explanation. Those words tell you almost everything. Because by then, the relationship had moved far beyond television. Mahoney was gone, but Grammer wasn't finished honoring him. When Frasier eventually returned years later, there were 2 quiet details that stood out. The new bar was called Mahoney's, and Frasier's grandson was named John. Neither needed a giant explanation. They were simply there, almost like little memorials hidden inside a television show. And then Grammer was asked about it publicly. That's when the emotion really came through. He explained that they couldn't bring Frasier back without honoring John. Because Martin was gone, John was gone, And now Fraser had to become the father. That sentence hit me harder than I expected, because suddenly the entire story came full circle. A 13-year-old boy loses his father. A young man loses his sister and brothers. He struggles for years to survive the pain. Then, decades later, he becomes an actor and accidentally finds a father figure on a television set. He gets 11 years with him, and then he loses him too. But this time, he doesn't simply bury the memory. He carries it forward. There's something incredibly human about that. John Mahoney couldn't give Kelsey Grammer back the childhood he lost. He couldn't erase what happened to his real father. But for 11 years, he could give him something different. A relationship, a presence, a version of fatherhood that arrived late, but still mattered. And maybe that's why Martin Crane feels so real when you watch Frasier today.